Hello, everyone. We are Cranla and Peter, and welcome to Being More Human, the Conversations. I am Cranla Warren, a psychotherapist and organizational psychologist, and I specialize in emotional intelligence, leadership, and values-based living. I'm an experienced leader, coach, and mentor, and I also fancy myself a people archaeologist.
Hey folks, I'm Peter Mostachetti. I'm a licensed social worker. I specialize in organizational leadership and professional development. I am a trauma-informed therapist, so everything that I do related to human behavior comes from a place of understanding that humans go through trauma and we have reactions to them. And we're here to talk.
Yes. So as two mental health professionals and workplace coaches, Peter and I have been sharing back and forth about this pandemic and supporting one another. And so our intention is to engage in real conversation and leave you with at least one takeaway for your consideration. The last time we talked about living in a state of collective pandemic and experiencing massive global trauma. Peter, maybe you want to give just a bit of a summary of session one before we jump into today.
Sure. So last time we were talking about the fact that everybody is going through a massive shared global trauma. And what that means at its most basic is too much happened too soon for our minds and bodies to integrate it into our experiences. And so we were feeling a certain way. You know, we were feeling anxious, angry, lots of things going on. And we're all still dealing with that in different ways at different levels of scale. I mean, if you think about what, you know, the experience that we're having in the US right now versus what Cranla's having up in Canada versus all of the horror that is happening right now in India. And my heart goes out to anybody who's watching us from India. I recognize how scary and uncomfortable this must be. So my hope is that whomever is watching, that you and your families are safe. Shared massive global trauma, and a couple of our conversations that we're going to have right today and follow on all deal with aspects of that. And so we're going to talk about when you go through a traumatic experience, one of the things that you may feel is a loss of control.
And we talked last time about feeling losses. They might be, you know, the loss of a loved one. We talked about losing our routines, a loss of power and control in our lives, and how we feel about that. And we talked about loss, grief, mourning. And so some of these very, very deep emotions and experiences, we were wanting people to actually get them out, write them down. What is an issue that you're struggling with right now? And how are you feeling about it? And I would add that if you find yourself judging yourself too harshly for what you've been feeling as you've been doing your best to navigate this pandemic, or how you've been trying to respond in this pandemic, be kind to yourself. Remind yourself that what you are feeling is normal. It's appropriate and normal given these circumstances that we have never lived through before. And if we treat ourselves harshly based on the intensity of this emotion that we're feeling, it really just increases the magnitude of that emotion. So just remind yourself, you're going through a crisis. You're showing up as a human being as best you can in a very abnormal situation.
And it's so important to remember not to compare yourself and your experiences and how you're responding to others. You know, we all have different circumstances. We all have different experiences. We all have different ways of coping with things. And so it's really important to, you know, as they used to say in elementary school, keep your eyes on your own paper.
Yes, I need that reminder. Peter, you're good for me with that in these conversations for sure.
You know, but it's the funny thing is, Cranla, you know, I can remind people until the cows come home, and I find myself doing it. You know, it's so easy to compare yourself to somebody else. You know, you're seeing somebody else's status updates on Facebook, you see what's happening on Instagram or on TikTok or something like that. And you're like, well, I'm just not coping as well as everybody else.
Right. Yeah. So as we try to transition from what we were sharing in the first session, I think it's important for us to look at what's next after we have looked at loss and grief and mourning the normalcy just the loss of control and power. What's next? And, I'm hearing a lot of people talking about feeling just blah. And it's making me think of an article I read. Adam Grant wrote an article about languishing. I don't know if you had a chance to read that. And he was talking about, and I shared this the last time. People are talking about living in this brain fog, living in a haze, feeling like you're in a blur. And it's not a depression necessarily. It feels more like a lack of motivation or a loss of joy. And I'm thinking of it because it's also a loss of a sense of personal power. And that really ties into what we're talking about today. But in this article, he just said it's this state of blah, or this state of like meh. He talked about the Simpsons and everything was like meh. And people have been spending a lot of time during this pandemic worrying about things that they cannot control, putting their energy into things over which they have absolutely no control. And when it's all over, I'm not going to be worrying about, my neighbor, because right now people are worrying about, well, my neighbor's done this, not, abiding by the stay-at-home order, or when's this pandemic going to be over? Like, these are things that are so outside of our control. And sometimes we focus on these external factors, like our neighbors, what they're doing, what they're not doing. And we might feel some like temporary energy from it in a way. And that might take care of that blah or that meh feeling. It's not necessarily helping us to deal with what we're feeling in terms of that dullness or that placid life we're living right now.
Yeah, you've got me thinking a little bit about this whole idea of it's almost like a sugar high, where it's temporary, it's quick, it gives you what you need to get out of the funk for a second, but it doesn't really last. It's that, and I don't want to call it false anger, but it's the outrage about whatever my neighbor or the person down the street is doing. And you can't control that. I mean, there's nothing you can control about it. And it's only going to serve. And I personally think that anger gets you out of that funk, but the only person that actually damages is yourself.
Yes. And I've seen a lot of that here. People really focusing on things that there's nothing we can do to control the lockdown order that we're living in right now in Ontario, Canada. So what's our next step in this whole theme of like being more human during the pandemic? Let's start looking at, what's within our locus of control. It's a psychological term. It refers to the extent to which we feel we have control over the events that influence our lives. And when you're dealing with a challenge in your life, do you feel like you have control or some influence over the outcome? That would be an internal locus of control.
Yep. Or
do you believe that you're simply at the mercy? You're at the mercy of the gods. You're at the mercy of outside forces. That would be an external locus of control.
And let's be honest, folks, there's really only two things that you can control in life: your behavior and how you respond to things. That's it. There's literally nothing else that you can control. Not your spouse, not your partner. You can't really control your kids as much as you'd like to. You can't control what the government is doing. You can't control how fast the vaccines are getting rolled out. And I don't know about you, Cranla, but that sounds a little scary.
Yes, exactly. Well, in the case of this pandemic, there really is legitimately so much outside of our control. And that's why I think we're seeing this anger, we're seeing this sense of this focus on the external. And that actually exacerbates our feelings of helplessness, right? Deepens our feelings of anxiety and depression.
Yep.
And so this is where I think we need to start steering ourselves in the direction of what is within our sphere of control. What can we influence? And it can help to combat this whole languishing that people have been talking about the last couple of weeks, when we can create some motivation and energy for ourselves and our lives. And there is a term that's been associated with this called flow. I think for our purposes, it really is about focusing on what's within our sphere of control and influence.
And folks, if you're listening to us right now and saying, oh God, but I'm so tired, I'm in that languishing mode, we're not asking you to take over the world. We're not talking about taking over the world. Cranla and I are talking about, finding small things, finding little ways that you can take control. I mean, it might be as simple as choosing a different pen for the day. I mean, whatever it is, whatever you can take control around, finding those moments and consciously taking control of them.
I love that. And as cliche as it sounds like, it's really about taking things one day at a time,
Yeah.
focusing on one thing at a time. And this is going to require setting boundaries for yourself, for your space, and for your time. And I know, Peter, you have a lot of expertise in teaching people around how to set and uphold their boundaries.
You know, boundaries are such an important topic, and folks, we'll put a link into the information around some really great resources around boundaries, because really boundaries at the end of the day are what's okay and what's not okay. And bottom line, I 100% believe this: you do not owe anybody else your mental health.
Hmm.
And that's where boundaries come in. Boundaries
Hmm.
come in protecting ourselves from the outside forces that would take away from the quality of our mental health.
Hmm. And letting in stressors and unnecessary distractions, particularly during these pandemic times, they're really going to affect our mood and dampen our motivation. And what we're talking about is, how do we get some of that motivation and energy flowing for ourselves so we can be beating those blahs?
Yeah.
And, I think what we want to do is ask, ourselves, what brings us joy?
Mm-hmm.
What do we find fulfilling? It could be a project, it could be a hobby. Peter, I know when you and I first started talking at the beginning of the pandemic, you were like, guess what? I'm teaching myself to crochet. And I was like, what? I said, I've
Yeah.
always wanted to do that because my grandmother tried to teach me how to knit and crochet, and I wasn't able to get it. But I really love and appreciate when other people do such a beautiful job with it.
I've had for I don't know how long, I've had a crochet hook sitting in my pen cup on my desk. I forget where it came from. It's been there for a decade and a half. And it's so much a part of my father's mother, my grandmother's identity. She was this wonderful fiber artist. She made clothes from flour sacks when
Mm.
during the Great Depression. She crocheted blankets. My father loves to tell stories about how she'd have 4 knitting needles going and would still be having a conversation with you while she's working up a sweater.
Wow.
So much about, of my family's history had to do with fiber arts. And so when all of this started back in, April of 2020, I said, let me give this a try. Let me try this. Let me get some yarn. Let me see what's happening. And so here we are a little over a year later, and this is my current project.
Oh, I love it. It looks very complex in its design.
It is. It's the beginning of a mandala blanket, and there is a woman who runs this fantastic website called Hooked on Sunshine, and this is all she does. She comes up with these very intricate patterns. This woman will literally send you a stack of stitches you need to know with tutorials, yarn lengths, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you sit there and go through this thing. And at the end, I think there's something like 6,000 stitches per side. I mean, they get really big.
Wow.
But I've been wanting to do one of these because it sort of, in my mind, was the penultimate project to get to.
Mm-hmm.
And what I have found is not only do I really enjoy doing that, it gets me away from my computer screen, but also there's really strong communities around this. So I'm in multiple Facebook groups of very active communities of people who are sharing their work, sharing their projects, asking questions, helping one another out. It's a really kind community of people because everybody just wants to help somebody get to the next level of their work. So so out of this thing that I wanted to do for myself, I've also found community to go with it.
Wow. And who would have predicted that before this pandemic?
No idea. I never would have taken the time to do this.
Exactly.
Because there was always something that had, I was going to this meeting or this rehearsal or this or this, that. And I never took the time to sit down and say, well, what would I like to teach myself that has nothing to do with my work? Because we're all doing education for work.
Right.
What do I want to teach myself that has nothing to do with that? And this is what came up. It's been really a joy for me.
Well, back to our point. Yeah. So you're really motivated. It's fulfilling and you're finding joy. And I love this idea of, even though we feel disconnected to a certain degree because everything seems to be on video conference calling, you have found your place in a community.
Yeah.
You're not languishing. You're really leveraging that internal control mechanism of what can you bring into your life wasn't there before that can help you to stay motivated and engaged, in life. Some people are really languishing. They're not feeling like there's this sense of aimlessness. For me, I started gardening. So as a child, I'd go and visit my grandparents, the same grandmother who tried to teach me how to knit and crochet. And she had quite the green thumb and did a lot of beautiful vegetable gardening. And I've come to have a bit of a community myself with my neighbor across the fence she started this massive vegetable garden. So I started hanging over the fence, socially distanced, of course, and asking about her butternut squash and the kinds of things she was growing. And I have a woman on my team who's quite an avid gardener, and every year she's doing and learning more and more and more. So I'm educating myself about gardening and started a little vegetable patch. And so for me, going out and checking that now that the weather's warmer here, that's really bringing me a sense of joy. So I guess, in summary, the best practice here that we're talking about and that we're sharing is really focusing on things that are within your control, and leave what is outside of your control, like in the distant rear view mirror. There is nothing that you can do to affect that. To your point, we can manage our own behavior, how we choose to respond, and setting boundaries and carving out space and time that you can, where you can enjoy these things that breeds energy for you. So, and the other thing we know is that when we feel like we're making progress in something, that's also like an energy boost. And that's also like a motivator. So look at how energized you were around your crocheting project. So channeling this internal locus of control will help us to beat that law of languishing.
Yeah, and folks, if there's a hobby or something that you like, it would really bring me a lot of joy to learn this or try that. People love to share their expertise. People love to share their expertise. I mean, you look at Cranla's example, her neighbors like sharing what they're doing. I've found this community of people who are dying to share what they know and help people along. So people really do love to share their expertise. And so if something that could potentially bring you joy isn't something you know today, don't let that stop you. There are people who
Yes.
want to share their expertise with you.
Yes. Yeah. And Peter, over to you to bring us home.
Alrighty, so folks, your homework, because I love giving homework. It's the frustrated teacher in me. What we'd really love is we'd love to hear, what small thing can you do to take better control of your life and your situation to kind of maybe help you move out of that languishing? So what's one thing? It could be small. It can be as small as I'm going to watch a YouTube video on a topic that I absolutely have been dying to learn how to do. It could be, I'm going to go buy myself a new pack of pens for work, whatever that is. But we'd love to hear, what's the one small thing that you can do today to take more control and pull yourself out of that languishing? And so I'm Peter, and that's Cranla, and this is Becoming More Human, the Conversations.